Thank you, Maine. Thank you all for being here. And to the First Nations on whose territory we find ourselves tonight, the Wolastoqey or Maliseet people, I say Walalan, thank you for your generosity and hospitality. Let me just check, all kinds of mics have been affixed to me, and I want to make sure everything is working, because I know that, and this does not happen all the time, there is an overflow room. So if the people in the overflow room can sing out, if you can't hear me, no, obviously they won't hear it, but let's hope they hear it, and they can tell us that. So if I've done anything wrong on the IT front, someone's bound to tell me. I'm also cognizant of time, so I'm not checking anything else on Twitter. I'm just making sure I've got stopwatch going. I'm really enormously honored to be invited by my alma mater, in the sense that I was so very honored to receive an honorary doctorate from the University of New Brunswick, to be invited here to the law faculty to speak on a topic which is on my mind pretty much constantly, and that is what we're facing in terms of the climate crisis. Climate emergency, climate breakdown. We're still, quite honestly, searching for the right language. I titled this talk 1.5 to Stay Alive many, many months ago. But we had just seen the IPCC report come out. It was October 8th, 2018, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a special report, special in the sense that they had been asked to prepare it by the negotiations and the negotiators in Paris in 2015. We had negotiated a treaty which set 1.5 as the average, global average temperature above which we must not go. So the Paris Agreement says that the world's nations working together will reduce greenhouse gases to the level to ensure that we don't go above, and this is a terrible target. This is how long it takes to just say the minimum target. We will not go above 1.5 global average temperature increase above the global average temperature that existed before the Industrial Revolution. If you say anything less than that, you haven't explained your target. And the Paris Agreement also said, or as far below 2 degrees as possible. And at that negotiation, the world governments also asked the scientific advisory body to all governments, and that's what it is, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, created in 1988, in order to advise policymakers about the evidence as it came forward, what we needed to do to avoid climate disaster. The phrase 1.5 to stay alive came to me when I was looking at the IPCC report, because that's literally what they've told us. And I'll come back to that. But the first time I heard that phrase had been in 2009 in the negotiations that failed. The negotiations in Copenhagen, where we had gathered to negotiate the successor agreement to Kyoto. By the way, Kyoto didn't fail. Most of the governments that took on commitments under Kyoto achieved their targets or exceeded them. It's only in Canada and the US that it is routinely dismissed as though it wasn't successful. But most nations kept their commitments under Kyoto. In 2009 in Copenhagen, we were gathered to negotiate what will follow, because Kyoto's targets ended in 2012, and we obviously have to continue to reduce greenhouse gases. Kyoto was at the time referred to as a down payment on future action. Now, going way back to the first United Nations Conference on Environment, to get a sense of the North-South dynamic, I want to take a big, broad sweep at this in terms of how does the world negotiate when we face global problems. And the first conference on the human environment was way back in Sweden, in Stockholm, in 1972. A Canadian was the Secretary General of that conference. Maurice Strong was the Secretary General. But the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment was marked, despite a couple of great speeches, Jane Jacobs' statement, "Never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world, indeed it's the only thing that ever has," was a speech Jane Jacobs gave to non-government organizations on the fringes of the Stockholm 72 conference. But Stockholm is largely remembered for the fact that in 1972 it was very hard to convince developing nations that a concern for the environment was anything other than a rich country's issue. that was not meaningful to them. Most of the global South boycotted the Stockholm 72 conference. Indira Gandhi was one of the only leaders of a developing country to attend, and there was a very clear North-South divide about, we are struggling to feed our people, we're not ready to worry about your pollution. Now, by 1992, at the Earth Summit, there was a very marked change. Number one, a conference on the environment and development. That's an important aspect. It was framed around sustainable development goals, framed around environment and development, but a country that had boycotted 20 years earlier hosted, because it was the Rio Earth Summit. So Brazil was hosting a gathering of nations to talk about environment and development and these twin threats. It was at Rio in June '92 that the fundamental legal document, the international treaty within which all our other actions has been framed, was signed. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in June '92. But there was something called the Rio Bargain, and it was very quickly violated. The Rio Bargain was this: all the legally binding treaties were negotiated around environmental issues. A treaty to protect global biodiversity, a treaty to respond to the climate crisis, and then there was a large parcel of non-binding promises by the rich countries to, for instance, end poverty. We had the recommitment of nations from the donor countries to the 0.7% target. Now, this was developed, by the way, by Lester B. Pearson, but not in his role as our former Prime Minister. He was on a UN commission that decided the best way that we could actually end global poverty would be if the wealthy nations were able to take just, not even 1%, but 0.7% of their GDP and provide it in development assistance. So that was the Rio Bargain that buttressed the fact that every nation on Earth came and signed on to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There was that sort of arc of global negotiations that now we had a deal. Developing countries were on board for climate targets, just as they've been on board for protecting our ozone layer in the 1987 Montreal Protocol, because we recognized that there was a pact to be made, that the issues north and south were different. Now, all that changed for me in a moment in Copenhagen in 2009, when I first heard the chant, 1.5 to stay alive. The negotiations in Copenhagen, and I won't go on and on about them, I will stop for questions if anyone's interested about where we lay the blame for a train wreck of negotiations that set the world's progress in reducing greenhouse gases back by at least 5 years. But the negotiations in Copenhagen were typified by bad faith bargaining, backroom elite gatherings that excluded the world's developing countries, and also a breakdown of the faith that had developed over many years through a UN system of consensus negotiations in a multilateral context in front of everybody. So in Copenhagen, you had the big countries go behind closed doors and say, here's the deal, and bring the text back. It was a bad situation. And the text said, 2 degrees will be good. 2 degrees of global average temperature increase is what we'll strive to avoid or achieve. That's one of the problems with setting targets that are limits that you don't want to hit. They suddenly become targets that people seem to think, okay, we go there. No, we want to avoid them. But in any case, in Copenhagen, suddenly, every nation from the African continent stood up and walked out, joined by every nation that qualified as a low-lying island state, stood up and marched out, and they all were chanting, 1.5 to stay alive. And they literally meant it. For low-lying island states to stay above the waterline, global average temperature could not go above 1.5 degrees Celsius. They knew this, they chanted it, joined by African nations that recognized that development isn't possible when you go through long periods of drought, followed by a year's rainfall in a month that washes away all the soil, that washes away any prospect of making progress in terms of development. And in that moment, I realized the situation had completely turned on its head. We were no longer hearing industrialized countries trying to get developing countries to be interested in an agenda about an environmental issue. We were hearing the global South saying very clearly, this is an existential threat to us. If you don't hold it at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will not survive as nations. And in that walkout, that very dramatic, it doesn't happen much in UN negotiations, that whole blocks of countries, as a matter of fact, I've never seen it anywhere before or since, the whole blocks of nations stand up and walk out together. The alliance that formed in that moment was low-lying island states, the developing nations, the poorest of the poor of Africa, joined and supported by their allies, the youth of the world. Every young person, every youth-led NGO stood up and walked out with them, chanting, 1.5 to stay alive. It was a dramatic about-face in what had been a north-south schism. We now saw the youth of the industrialized world clearly aligned with a future that said to young people, 1.5 to stay alive, not as a nation state, but as an individual, recognizing what their future would hold if we allowed global average temperature increases to just continue to grow. Now, generationally, I'm seeing a lot of this happen in Canada too, and it's an interesting thing to observe. Some of you may know, and I apologize because as a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada and Nova Scotia, you're not supposed to get arrested. I do appreciate that the Nova Scotia Law Society, Barristers Society, recently absolved me of a complaint that said I had violated my oath. They actually found that in some cases, people who have been practicing law have an obligation to face arrest to change a law that might be wrong. I was very grateful to the Nova Scotia Bar Society. But in any case, I chose arrest in the case of the Kinder Morgan pipeline issue because I made a commitment to First Nations leadership in British Columbia that if they were going to face arrest, I would stand in solidarity with them. I only mention this because being in court, in Judge Affleck's court in Vancouver, led me to become a witness to a number of very interesting things that are developing in our world. And that is that the prosecutor for the BC government, and I wasn't actually in the courtroom when this was said, but said to the judge, we've got to increase the sentences. Because we're now facing, but at this point I'd gotten a very large fine, but other people were after me were being subjected to 1 week in prison or jail and then 2 weeks and so on. And the prosecutor for the BC government said, we have to increase the sentences because we're facing a group of people who clearly have nothing to lose. We're facing all these seniors. Oh yes, Grandma is at the barricades and nothing's turning us away because we're committed to saving the lives of our grandchildren. So here's where I see something really interesting happening around 1.5 to stay alive. My generation, the elders, allied with the youth, who are willing to say, I'm not going to go to school today, because why am I in school learning skills that I will use in a future career that I can't have unless people act very, very soon. These are all very new dynamics in the nature of the human family. We can no longer be divided between the rich and the poor. Can't be divided between the old and the young. We're now divided between those who understand that burning fossil fuels is threatening our future or our existence, and those who want to pretend we have a lot more time to burn fossil fuels. Essentially, everyone understands that the end of fossil fuels is inevitable. Big oil understands it. They just want a little bit more time. Every day that they take from us, they steal from our children. So the dynamic we face now is youth leadership, seniors prepared, and the same dynamic that the BC court noted in Vancouver over the Kinder Morgan arrests was witnessed on the bridges of London following the report of the IPCC, when a new movement called #ExtinctionRebellion decided to have as many people as possible arrested on bridges throughout London. There was one gentleman reported in The Guardian who was in his 80s and was arrested 4 times in 1 week. Because he said, what else can I do? I'm thinking about my grandchildren. So when we come to 1.5 to stay alive, who else is saying it besides low-lying island states, the poorest of the poor, our children, our elders? We're also hearing it from our scientists. Scientists are saying with increasing panic, and scientists aren't prone to panic, and they're also not inherently good communicators. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tried to find its feet as clearly as it could. Now bear in mind, it's also an intergovernmental panel, which means that the consensus report of the scientists had to be vetted and approved by scientists appointed by the US government and the Saudi government. And still the report came out saying what it was saying, which you can take to mean that the news is a bit worse than what the IPCC said. But the scientists are telling us that if we go above 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, we run far too high a risk of unleashing something we can't stop. There is a point that used to be described to me in theoretical terms, and I used to talk to scientists who say, oh well, that's a hypothetical possibility, but we're nowhere near that. And unfortunately, through years and decades of procrastination on this issue, we're actually near the things that used to be described as hypothetical possibilities we don't need to consider. It was Dr. Digby McLaren, who was the president of the Royal Society of Canada. And for those of you who aren't scientists and don't know the Royal Society, they're not monarchists, they're Canada's best scientists. And they are fellows of the Royal Society. And Dr. Digby McLaren, who had an illustrious career in the Royal Geological Survey, was the first person to try to tell me about what he called runaway global warming. And he said, and he explained to me, it's one of the reasons he didn't believe there was such a thing as sustainable development. He said, we actually have to move much faster, we have to be much clearer, we can't keep burning fossil fuels, because as we burn fossil fuels, we create conditions which start triggering events with positive feedback loops. So, for instance, when 400 forest fires burned this summer in interior British Columbia, every single forest fire released the carbon that had been sequestered through photosynthesis through the life of that forest. That is a pulse of warming gases to create warmer, drier conditions to create more forest fires. Just as the warmer water came up from the Pacific and the warmer water began to melt the Arctic. This is one of the reasons that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports tend to underestimate a threat, was that they initially didn't really factor in positive feedback loops. So the warmer water was melting Arctic ice. The positive feedback loop is that the ice on our Arctic creates something called the albedo effect. I'm sure a lot of you already know all this, so I'm sorry for covering ground you've heard so often before. But it's basically global fashion advice. Why do we wear white in summer? It keeps us cooler because it bounces away the warmth of the sun. The ice cap creates, through its whiteness, the sun's rays and the heat of the sun are largely bounced back to space when they hit ice. But when the ice has melted and dark ocean water has opened up, the sun's radiated heat is sucked into the ocean, thus heating the water more, melting the ice faster, and creating a positive feedback loop to heat the water more, melt the ice faster. The positive feedback loop that scares me the most is the melting permafrost. Permafrost, as you can imagine, is that ground that is permanently frozen, but what was it before it froze? It was largely muskeg. It was swampy stuff. And so what we have frozen in permafrost is a lot of methane gas. So as the permafrost melts, it releases methane, further speeding up the heating process with the risk of melting more permafrost. Scientists have calculated that if we were to lose all of the Earth's permafrost, if we let it melt, it will release 4 times more greenhouse gases than everything released by humanity since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So it's super important to keep the Arctic as cold as possible to stop most of that, or even more than now, that is inevitable, from melting. Because if we lose, as we lose permafrost, it has an immediate acute effect in Inuit communities. It means the land subsides, houses fall over, it creates very dangerous conditions, but we can't risk allowing the world's permafrost to melt. Now those are just some of the things that scientists understand about positive feedback loops. Those are some of the reasons that I've been focused on climate change since when I first learned about it in 1986 from scientists at Environment Canada when I worked in the Minister of Environment's office. But now we have very clear advice from the world scientists, and the report that was written as advice to the policymakers meeting once again at COP. Now, you know, we had COP 21 in Paris. This year it was COP 24 in Katowice, Poland. And it was on the agenda of COP 24 to review the IPCC report, the special report that this very body had asked them to prepare. What is the difference between 1.5 and 2, and can we still hold to 1.5? And what the scientists told us, which is really good news, is we can hold to 1.5. The part that's discomforting is, oh yes, and if we fail to do that and go to 2, we're looking at the potential for the collapse of human civilization or worse. Now in that context, I have to say I really didn't think that we would have a conference of the parties within 6 weeks of the IPCC report that managed to avoid dealing with it. The president of Fiji, who was the outgoing president of the COP from our last convention, which actually the Conference of Parties last year was actually in Bonn, but it was actually the first Pacific COP because Fiji doesn't have the infrastructure to host a global climate negotiation. So the president of Fiji remained very involved in these negotiations. But he said, can we be so craven and selfish and indifferent that we're not going to act in response to this report? I guess by their silence, the rest of the world said yes. Only Fiji and the Marshall Islands improved their targets at COP24. One of the other people who spoke to the delegates at COP24 was a voice for all that youth all around the world, now younger, not someone who could have spoken in Copenhagen, but now, or at least in December, 15 years old, a schoolgirl from Stockholm, Greta Thunberg. Greta has an extraordinary clarity of her voice, and she's honest. She is the kind of honesty that takes no prisoners. She looked at her audience, the collected countries of the world with their negotiating teams, and essentially said, I'm not going to quote her, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm not here to ask you to do something. You've been asked before and you've done nothing. I don't expect you to do anything. You don't have the courage to even tell it like it is, even that burden you leave to your children. This is, as I said, a take no prisoners speech. She also said when she was speaking more recently in Davos to the World Economic Forum, and by the way, she travels to all of these engagements by train. She said to the delegates in Davos, it's at this point in a speech that adults usually ask us to find hope and to show youth how to be hopeful. And she said, I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to panic and then to act. I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is. So here we are in 2019, in my country, that I love, that was in 1988 in the lead in acting for climate action. We hosted the first Global Climate Science Conference. We helped host and support the first global climate target. I'm not going to bore you with the number of targets that Canada has said we will hit and that we never tried to hit. They pile up behind us and they give, strangely enough, perversely enough, they allow people that I know now in places of power in Ottawa to say, targets don't matter because we don't hit them. You know, the target to save the ozone layer worked. We lived up to it, we hit it, and as a result, the world is now not debating what to do about the loss of the ozone layer and the UV rays that are reaching crops and frying them and killing people with excess cancers. We now celebrate, as we should, that the ozone layer is repairing itself. Targets work if you have the political will to meet them, if you pay attention, if you set a target that is consistent with what must be done, and then you roll up your sleeves and you hit it. That's how we fought acid rain in this country and succeeded in cutting by 50% a target. 50% of the sulfur dioxide from sources across eastern Canada were cut. The ozone layer, first negotiated agreement in Montreal in 1987, was that industrialized countries would reduce, and this is again back to the north-south divide and trying to figure out what got called in Montreal and then again in Kyoto, and it's still a big issue in UN negotiations. Common but differentiated responsibilities. That's why in Montreal, to protect the ozone layer, we could say the industrialized world must reduce by 50% its emissions of chlorofluorocarbons and ozone-depleting substances. Developing countries can sign on to this protocol and increase their emissions by 15%. At that time, the argument from developing countries was, we need to preserve food so that people don't get sick from rotting food. It's you in the industrialized world who created this problem of ozone depletion. You find the alternatives and then we'll use them. That was the bargain in Montreal and it worked. But we set targets and we hit them and we were guided by science. It's only been on the issue of climate change that world resolve has been so desperately weakened by deliberate campaigns of disinformation by big oil. It's very clear that that's what happened. I remember former Secretary General to the Brundtland Commission, Jim McNeil, a brilliant Canadian and global diplomat. He said at the end of the Rio Earth Summit, well, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is too weak, and the other thing that just happened is the Carbon Club just formed. So all of our negotiations from 1986 to 92 to get a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change took place in a context where we weren't facing large organized propaganda campaigns against taking action to save ourselves and avoid climate change altogether. If we had acted in 92 on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, if we hit the target Canada had set, if we led the world to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, we could have prevented the things that are now no longer preventable. We are now locked in, because we are now at 1 degree Celsius, global average temperature, 1 degree Celsius above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. And we're on track for sure to hit 1.5, and it will take something of a miracle to hold it at 1.5. Canada's current target, well, let me just, before I move to Canada, collectively, all the countries on Earth, the current collection of targets, if followed and executed on time by every country on Earth, the collection of governmental promises, if delivered, take us to somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 degrees Celsius. So that's why the IPCC was quite forthright. We need to pay attention. This is a wake-up call. We need to reduce global emissions of greenhouse gases by 45% below 2010 levels, and we need to make sure it's done by 2030. That doesn't mean we have 12 years. That means we have no time at all, because the scale of work that will be required to achieve a 45% reduction in greenhouse gases globally. That scale of work was described by IPCC scientists as transformative, Herculean, unlike anything we've ever seen human society accomplish. Now, in that context, we come to the question, finding hope and honesty in dangerous times. We surely cannot survive if we don't embrace the reality that we will. We have to, at all levels of government, all aspects of society, in all countries and all ages, have to decide we've got this one chance. We've got a chance to ensure that we stop relying on fossil fuels as quickly as possible, that we replant forests. We've got to replant trees everywhere. We've got to do everything we can for sequestration. That we transform our economy from one that's been dependent on fossil fuels to something else. Now, there's lots of good news in that the something else's we need are all invented. We don't have to wish and hope, oh, if only we had an alternative to fossil fuels. Everywhere you look, with the exception of jet fuel for our airplanes, everywhere you look in society, there is a replacement for fossil fuels. There are replacements in providing electricity. The huge step we must take is to decarbonize electricity around the world. And a lot of countries are doing it already. Other countries are already banning the internal combustion engine because the alternative to the cars we've been driving around for decades is cars that you plug in at night or during the day. My favorite notion of what my future looks like, because I plug in my car now, but it's a Prius Prime and I don't have enough of a battery charge for the work I have to do when I'm home in DC. So I fall back on the hybrid part of my car's engine when I run out of the battery part. But I've got a friend just up the island slightly from me in the Cowichan Valley who plugs in his car to his house, and 100% of the car driving needs he has are met with solar panels on the roof of his house. This is not science fiction stuff, as one of my friends was saying the other day. This isn't even trying to remember the Jetsons. Actually, that was Megan Mitten and Sackville's. It's not like the Jetsons. This is all stuff we've already invented and can put to use. So it is very important to be hopeful in our message. But back to Greta Thunberg, she said, I don't want to hear from you about endless green economic growth. If that happy talk worked, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. So somehow we have to figure out how to be honest about the threat, hopeful in inspiring each other every single day that we actually have the tools we need to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. We know we can. We've been told by the IPCC we can. And yet here we are in Canada in 2019, and of all the targets I've mentioned that we stacked up and missed, we're now clinging to the one that was the weakest one ever selected. Stephen Harper's third. Stephen Harper weakened our climate target 3 times. We are now still under the regime that Canada's climate action is to reach Stephen Harper's third and weakest target. 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. It hasn't been improved a single ton since the Liberals took office. And I don't know that they didn't intend to. Circumstances, I can make excuses for people, but I can't make excuses anymore because this is a climate emergency. So we need as a country, and this is where I get excited about the potential. COP25, God help us, 25 years of climate conferences after the negotiation of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I brought my baby to the Rio Earth Summit. She couldn't walk yet. She's been working on her PhD now. She's made a heck of a lot more progress than the world's governments ever since we met in Rio in 1992. We have to stop allowing governments to continually debate the irrelevant. Now, I'm sorry to say that the main content of Canadian media and political culture discussion around climate is to talk endlessly about carbon taxes, as if the possibility of doing one little thing is more frightening than letting things continue to get worse. Carbon taxes are a very small piece and not necessary. If you want to, we can go to carbon rationing. I don't think Andrew Scheer would like that. I don't think Dwayne Higgs would like that. It's just to say, we have a lot more choices that we could go to, and a lot more policies that we can embrace. But I'd rather go for the ones that create the most jobs by changing our economy and ensuring that we have things like efficient rail service, ensuring that we have things like an electricity grid fueled by nothing but renewable energy, and ensuring that our businesses, institutional, residential, commercial, are all operating in a way that means they generate their own power instead of wasting energy by heating the outdoors in the winter and cooling the outdoors in the summer. This is all possible. So finding honesty in dangerous times is hard enough because nobody in the political world, well, except I guess me, nobody that I debate in Parliament on a daily basis wants to face these facts. Some of them don't understand the facts at all. In the emergency debate on climate change, actually it was on a different debate on carbon taxes. I won't say what party he was from, leave it to your imagination, said, you people in British Columbia have had a carbon tax for years. It didn't stop your forest fires. So we do need some basic education. And that education may end up happening in Canada during an election campaign. But what I wanted to share with you today, and then I want to open the floor to questions virtually immediately, is this. We can get through this. We can hug our babies at night and know that they have a secure future, whether they're our babies or our grandbabies or our nieces or our nephews. What kind of generation would condemn their children, their babies, to an unlivable world within their lifetime? I am not exaggerating, it is not hyperbole, this is what we're facing. An unlivable world within the lifespan of our children. I'm not prepared, as Professor Thomas Homer Dixon, some of you will know Tad Homer Dixon's work, as he was speaking in September to the Green Party convention, he spoke of his own children. He said, I'm not prepared to tell them that we are a failed species. None of us should be prepared to walk away from this challenge. It will take courage. It will take hard work. It will take throwing off the notion that we're still in a status quo world. The world has changed, and we must respond as people, as Homo sapiens, as grown-ups. We must respond without partisanship, without rancor. We must reach out and love absolutely everyone we can, as much as we can, all the time, and say, come with me. We've got solar panels to put on our roofs. We've got some trees to plant. And we've got some big oil to shut down. Thank you.
We have 20 minutes for
questions. Oh no, I forgot about, I set my timer for my time. I forgot all the introductions. I'm so sorry. All right, so time is running out, just like in my speech.
We're limited, folks. So there's a microphone there. You can cue there. I ask you to keep it to please one brief question per person so we can get as many questions as possible.
Excuse me. Yeah, you painted a very bleak picture. And I'm wondering, you said the goal, the target should be 1.5. And you said if the whole world, the countries of the world keep to their promise, we can only achieve 2.5 to 3.5. So if that is the case, it's still bleak. So what's the solution to it?
Thank you, and I don't know your name, but thanks.
Oh, sorry, my name is Emeka Ezekides.
Thank you. The reason I told you what the current targets are is that they're clearly insufficient. The good news around the Paris Agreement is that it was negotiated, so the targets are not baked in. The targets are tabled with the UN Secretariat in Bonn. They can be removed at any time and replaced but only by ratcheting up to tougher targets. So what we must do, now I left out that one of the people who spoke at COP24 was UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who actually referred to the conference's results as immoral and potentially suicidal. You would have thought someone would have reported that. But in any case, he's called for a climate summit of heads of government alongside the UN General Assembly meeting in September this year to bring in tougher targets. Now the timing is bad in terms of Canadian politics because it will be all around elections by then, but every country on earth has to ratchet up its target to be consistent with what the IPCC has said. And by the way, I think we should assume, because it's always been the case, that the IPCC advice is giving us more time than we actually have. So the more aggressive the targets, the better, the faster we act, the better, and we can do this because a lot of the technologies that I mentioned we have are beating down the doors to get in. These are disruptive technologies that make a revolutionary change in our economies, and for some reason, governments are continuing to try to support the industries that are yesterday to stop tomorrow from getting in the door. So we can do this, but we start by recognizing that new targets are needed, and they're not just targets, it means the end of fossil fuels as an energy source.
Hi. I work on women's rights, and one thing that I was interested in as the debates about the pipeline were happening is the discussion about gender effects and the sexual violence that occurs on pipeline crews, etc., that particularly affects Indigenous women. And the government was almost, it seemed, universally mocked for even bringing that up. So my question for you is, what do you see as the gender impacts about our reliance on fossil fuel and climate change?
Thanks. Well, clearly, and through the UN negotiations, there's always been an understanding, and it's actually built into a number of the preambular documents to the Paris Agreement, that women are a vulnerable population more than, there's a gender issue there. Women are the major producers of food around the world, are on low-scale small farms, women farmers. Women are, as caregivers, more often than not, the people looking after the displaced. So we're going to be seeing, depending on whether we hold to 1.5 or go beyond it, we're going to be seeing somewhere between hundreds of thousands or millions of environmental refugees. Women are always in a situation of trying to care for people, internally displaced people, refugees on the march. Women are displaced. Women are also carrying the load. At the same time, as we talk about resource camps, there's no question that the Trail of Tears runs along in a number of places where Indigenous women and murdered and missing Indigenous women. The evidence has been at least suggestive that there is a proximity to work camps. And work camps, and this is where Justin Trudeau was, I think, unfairly maligned and attacked, because he said there are gender issues, because work camps can sometimes lead to gender violence. And it was really interesting meeting with some of the mayors through New Brunswick over the last couple of days, talking to people in communities about the impact of the Fort McMurray work camps. I have not had it brought home to me as clearly as it was by some people I've met with this week, that STDs and abusive relationships and addiction issues and opioids came back to the Maritimes through the fact that workers were leaving their families in work camps. Work camps are not a healthy community environment, and it does bring social issues and violence against women home to communities. And this is not to say, because the construction workers got all over Justin Trudeau to say, you're saying construction workers are violent. Not every construction worker, obviously. Tons of fathers left their families, because I'm from Cape Breton. Tons of families were separated. The work that was done was often done by, probably majority very, very decent people. I'm not going to get into that. What it's clear is on the evidence is that, and I remember being in Fort McMurray on an environmental assessment hearing on the Shell Jackpine mine, and the local doctors were testifying that in those work camps, they saw every form of trauma, they saw every form of abuse, they saw drug use and violence and trauma, and a work camp of a lot of individual men on their own being paid a lot of money in a boring place is a dangerous place and brings social unrest and violence against women with it. That's just the facts, and I am apologizing right away because I know that I will be hearing from the same people to whom Justin Trudeau wrongfully apologized instead of amassing the evidence and explaining that what he said was true. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Nadine Buzina, and first of all, I just want to thank you so much for being here and giving this talk. I think my question mostly comes from, how do you get outside of the echo chamber effect, whereas everyone in this room is on your side and we believe, but how do we get outside of the bubble of people that don't believe yet and that we can't convince? Because I think sometimes that's the most frustrating part, is that everyone you talk to agrees, and yet nothing is being done. So what can we do, besides be the leader of the Green Party of Canada, to get our voices...
Would you like to take it on? Because that's fantastic.
And then even if we watch you struggle to be heard across the globe, what can we do to make those who don't believe find this a more appealing solution and something that they can adapt into their lives?
Okay. So Nancy, I will confess that I'm a Christian, I'm an Anglican, and so using words like what people believe is appropriate when we're discussing religion. But it doesn't apply to science. So I don't believe in climate change. I understand the science. I believe in a lot of other things that most of my friends don't believe in anymore. That's okay. Belief is one thing, faith is one thing, understanding science is something else. So when we have a lot of people who don't understand the science, it's very worrying, particularly if they're in elected office. If you have neighbors, friends, really grumpy uncles who don't understand why you're worried about climate change, keep talking to them. Express what you understand about the science clearly. Give them books to read. Don't write them off. Keep explaining it and explaining it. Give them Catherine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist and, by the way, an evangelical Christian from Canada who now works in Texas, who's got really good 3-minute YouTube videos. She explains things really well. Don't give up on people. Don't condemn anyone who's fallen for massive amounts of expertly prepared, billions of dollars thrown at it, propaganda. But we don't have those resources. We can only explain and explain. Now, to the government officials, politicians who claim to understand that climate is important, then you have to call them to task and have to say to Catherine McKenna, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, yes, it's great that you express so clearly that we must act. When will you? She promised in December 2015 that the Harper target was weak and was just the floor. We will do better. And within a year, it was back to where it was under Harper. An ambitious target, difficult to reach. And now, without a really effective climate plan in Canada, we haven't even brought back half of the things that were in Paul Martin's climate plan in 2005, which was really very good. So don't give up on people and don't stay in an echo chamber.
Hi, my name is Wesley Fink. Thank you so much for being here. Addressing climate change is something that I'm very passionate about. And you mentioned that we have all the technology and the means of energy production to stop using fossil fuels. And I know that nuclear power, nuclear energy is one technology that is very clean in terms of carbon emissions. So I was just wondering, what is like the #1 or some of the biggest barriers to scaling up our use of nuclear energy?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Wesley. I'm going to leave aside the arguments about why nuclear might not be appropriate for other reasons. I'm just going to say that in studying it and looking at how do we move fast, nuclear energy is in our way. It takes a long time to build a new reactor. It takes a long time to retube one. Look at Point Lepreau and the money on that. What we really need to do is move with those technologies that can be start to finish, reduce greenhouse gases as fast as possible, creating as many jobs as possible. and doing it as cheaply as possible per ton of carbon reduced. Those technologies are now solar. Solar is now cheaper than coal compared if you're starting a new plant, a new electricity plant. The lifetime costs of solar are now cheaper than coal. I never thought that would happen in my lifetime. That is a sea change. Then you also can look at wind energy. Wind energy is fast to uptake and has a very, very good impact quickly. The piece of technology that's really the most exciting right now is how we have storage of renewable energy. Because we have more than enough renewable energy all around the world, no question. How do we store it so when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, we've got it? Now, there's a lot of really cool research being done in a new generation of battery power. You know, how do we store this energy? If we think about large batteries, that's one thing. But elegant, simple, and available all across Canada because of our vast landmass, and because particularly on a lot of Indigenous lands, a lot of the renewable energy in Canada, by the way, right now is being generated by First Nations on Indigenous territory. But the other really cool thing is that there are an awful lot of abandoned quarries and old mine sites. Now, why am I mentioning those? Because any hole full of water up above the landmass is a great battery storage. You just do between Denmark and Norway, they do this when there's so much wind energy in Denmark that they can't use it. They sell it to Norway. This happens all the time. They sell it to Norway. Norway uses that wind energy to pump water up into existing reservoirs where it sits till a day that the wind isn't blowing so much in Denmark, and then they just open the sluices and you've got hydropower from being able to constantly recycle a gravity-fed pumped storage is what it's called. And I've got friends working with Indigenous communities right across Canada saying, we need to harness every single old hole in the ground as a battery storage for hydro and wind. I mean, these are elegant solutions. And unfortunately, another thing about nuclear energy is it embeds something that I'm hoping we're going to get rid of. We can democratize energy in the transition away from fossil fuels so that we no longer are dependent on a large mega project with wires stretching in all directions. We can in a subdivision, we can in a small community, we can in an apartment building, we can in a university, generate all the power that that institution needs locally. Then you don't have the risk of a big windstorm, a big ice storm, and all the power goes down. I was living in Cape Breton in summer of August 2003. Who remembers August 2003 when all the power went out for Eastern Canada, Toronto, and a big chunk of the US? Talk about a rigid, breakable, bad energy system. We all lost our power because of a rogue tree branch in Ohio. So you want resilient systems, you want social cohesion to take care of each other when things go badly, because we're going to be experiencing a lot of disruptive, we're going to be experiencing extreme weather events. That means it really matters to live in a place like New Brunswick and know your neighbors and be able to take care of each other. But it also makes sense to democratize energy, and nuclear power stands in the way of that.
So,
No?
well, here's the thing though, we have a wonderful reception planned.
Oh, we have the reception.
Where
Eat, drink, and be merry.
exactly. Before we have that, our students would just like to present you with something.
And I want to thank you all for your patience. This is a hard talk to give. I haven't given one quite this honest to anyone before.